Welcome everyone again. I'd just like to introduce you to our host today. Julian Butler is a Jesuit undertaking formation for the Catholic priesthood. He previously practiced law and also has degrees in commerce and philosophy. Julian is a contributor at Jesuit Communications, a chaplain at Xavier College in Melbourne, and a board member at Jesuit Social Services. Our guests today are Caitlin Humphrys. Caitlin is the founder of Consent Education and an accredited professional counsellor with experience working in suicide prevention, as well as the alcohol and other drugs field. Prior to counselling, she spent 17 years working with teenagers, predominantly in personal and leadership development within secondary schools. And she's currently undertaking a project for Cairns Diocese Catholic Education Services, reviewing relationship education programs used in their schools. Our other guest is Stephen Locke. Stephen has 29 years working in Catholic education and is an education officer for religious education, working in Brisbane Catholic Education. He trained as a primary school teacher and spent 16 years in classrooms in both Brisbane and Melbourne. He's also been an assistant principal for religious education in schools before moving to his current role. So I'll just hand it over to Julian for the session. Thanks, Julian.
Thanks very much, Mick. And again, just to remind participants to please put questions in the chat and we'll come to them as the conversation goes on. Caitlin, I might begin with you. You've written before for Australian Catholics about, to jump straight in, about a cultural perception in contemporary culture and society that sex is something that's done to rather than with others. Presumably this perception comes from somewhere, and I wonder if you might just tell us a bit about where young people are learning about sex and relationships and what that means for what their starting points are in understanding those things, sex and relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a really great piece of data on student voice that was released last year. It's called the Sex Education in South Australia survey. And it was collected last year and released last year, done by the Commissioner for Young People. And so it's a great way to capture what our young people are thinking in this space, which we don't have a lot of data in it. One of the things that is unsurprising and shocking in the same sense was that 78.7% of these young people, there's 1,225 young people surveyed, said that the internet was their first source of information when it came to relationships and sexuality and sex. And I think what's not surprising then about where, and it is a stereotype, it's not that all of our young people would view sex as something that is done to someone or not with someone, but I think it is there quite strongly. And if our young people's curiosity is getting met by the internet, not by trusted adults, regardless of whether they want to end up there or not, then pornography is a massive influence in that space. And certainly something that does feed that message of sex being something that is done to and not with. I think the beauty of consent becoming part of the national conversation and part of mandated curriculum is now we're saying not only should we, but do we have permission to do this, but we're required to create a safe space for our young people's curiosity. Because the other interesting part about that data that said that even though that's where young people go, there were so many different student voice snippets in it about how they were saying they know it's not the best, but it's the easiest and most accessible for them. So they recognise in themselves it's not the best place to get their information, but that ease and lack of shame in going and asking questions. So I think that's just a significant feed into that culture of sex and people as commodity.
Stephen, I wonder if you might say something on the back of that about, given your experience in primary education and current work, about what students are bringing to the classroom when these conversations start to happen and where their starting point is.
Yeah, I guess, Julian, from my perspective, when I was listening to Caitlin talk, I think sometimes it's hard because we have somewhat, I'll use schizophrenic understanding of sex and relationships in our society, from the point of view that we see all around us images of sexualized images all the time, whether it be in media, whether it be in video clips, even movies, billboards everywhere, internet, whether it be, Twitter or, what's the other one? I can't remember, Instagram. And so this is how it's told. Yet at the same time, when things occur of a highly sexualized nature, there's also this sense of outrage. How can this be happening? People shouldn't be behaving like that. We only have to look at how sportsmen and women behave, and if they're suddenly doing something of a sexualized nature, which is condoned and seen in all sorts of other forums within society, we suddenly say, oh no, that's wrong. And we want to hold that together. And I don't think just for children, but for adults as well. I think it's really important that, I know we're talking about young people today, but the complexity of relationships is broader than just children. And I think that stretches back to people's individual experiences growing up. What was their household like? What was their background? How was that brought together? That then plays out in schools with teachers in terms of, what do I say to young people? Because I don't feel comfortable talking about this myself. Mm. So when we come to them, so what questions are kids asking? How equipped are our teachers and our parents to answer those questions when they do come up? Because the survey, Caitlin mentioned the South Australian survey, but I know when our people were putting together our documentation, they used the La Trobe University study, the 4-year study into sexual health of teenagers and things like that. And what comes out all the time is kids want to know more, not just about the biology. This is how babies are made. What does it feel like? What is the relationship? What do I do if someone asks me and I want to say no? And unless you've got a parent who wants to take you through that, and that means an active role of parents in the relationships and sexuality stuff with their kids, then I think something is missing, because then teachers are the ones who then feel the burden, but they don't feel comfortable themselves. 2 examples I would use, I know it's not about the kids saying what they would ask, but I think what Caitlin's saying, where do they then get it from? Where did they get it from in the 80s is also the question. And then the 90s, where have we ever got it from? And where, and not just in a Catholic setting. I think societally, broadly, there's shifting changes, and it changes so rapidly. What do we actually say? And now, without causing offence, because I think that's a really important part of the question too. But 2 examples. I was doing a relationships and sexuality shape paper talk with some teachers online, as we do, just to orientate them to a Catholic position from our system's point of view. And I was talking with 3 other teachers, 2 in leadership positions who would have been mature in terms of 40 and 50. And then another young one who's an early careers teacher, basically in their 2nd year. And she was sort of saying, I said, well, we'd heard a lot from all of us oldies. And I said to her, what's your take on all of this? What's your perspective as a younger person? They're only in their early 20s. And they said, oh, it's really interesting. Kids come to me because I teach grade 7s and 8s. They want to ask me because I'm more close to their age. If you think of it, 4 years earlier, they're only just in high school themselves. But she said, my friends and I are still trying to figure all this stuff out themselves. And I think that's a really clear example of the fact that even when you're older, you don't always have it all figured out. Mm. So openness and transparency about how we might discuss things and feeling comfortable with that, being able to name what it is in society that we, the confusing things in society, and then saying, what is, if we're talking Catholic schools, what is a Catholic perspective? How do we understand that in an idea of, we jump straight to sex and consent without the talk about relationship, intimacy, vulnerability, because that's hard for anybody to talk about. And then going, that takes time and patience, and it takes you saying it's messy. And I think, so we jump straight to consent and sex as a thing, as Caitlin was saying, without seeking to understand its context in which we find sex, and that even for married couples, a sexual relationship can still be fraught with how you navigate the emotions and everything else. And then sexuality, regardless of whether you're married, celibate, or whatever your role, needs to be expressed as a life force. And I think those sorts of things, even in our Catholic schools, in a secular sense, even when you look at secular resources, they don't get broadly touched on. And I wonder about that. And I also wonder, when I had another teacher in a grade 3 classroom, we were talking about this. And in grade 3, it's not like high schools, it's body parts and stuff like that. And this teacher said, oh, I don't like using the body part names. I feel uncomfortable with that. So we have to be comfortable naming body parts, talking about that, and talking about that with our children from a very young age in a way that is powerful, but also at an age-appropriate stage when the children bring it up themselves. And so when children I've taught in primary school or my own children say, oh, Dad, talking about body parts, we say it's a penis, it's a scrotum, I'm not, it's testicles, this is what it is. But that's also from a point of view of safety, because if there is someone touching you in a way, you need to be able to name that. So that's maybe a convoluted answer, Julian, to add in, but I think it sort of adds into the idea of consent and where do kids get it from. And as Caitlin said, if we don't do it ourselves, if we don't take the responsibility, the null curriculum, that which we choose not to teach, therefore they'll find it somewhere else. So what's our responsibility in partnership with parents? That's really hard though.
I think just to add to that, I know we've got a lot more questions to get to, but I think Stephen's just hit it on the head. One of the biggest things in the review and the work up in Cairns was the need to build staff confidence and capacity, not out of a lack of trust or a dismissal of our staff's ability, but we didn't get comprehensive relationship and sexuality education. We didn't have a place, and I say we, but as Stephen's mentioned, that's generations, hopefully this generation currently in our younger primary and high school will be different, but the investment to educate, building our staff and having that space, and doing staff training the other week, and a primary school staff, as Stephen mentioned, naming the body parts is core to protective behaviours work in primary. It's crucial. And, I had a staff member who would have been a couple of decades older than me saying, how am I supposed to be comfortable saying those words when I've never in my life had a space where I've been allowed to say those words? She said, I'll even go to the doctor and I feel awkward and uncomfortable. I'm like, well, this is the space to get comfortable. So we can't expect staff to pick up any curriculum and for it to work and have a positive impact without building their confidence and capacity. And I think that is, as Stephen said, far more than just consent and sex. I think the need for positive relationships and communications and self-discovery to happen in a safe place for our staff, parents, and students as a systemic approach is key to this all being successful and not just another mandate. Sorry.
Thanks to you both. It's a question in the chat from David Walker, which is, when did these conversations start and on what topics? And I think you both picked up the sense that this has got to be, the conversations have got to be responsive to where students are at, right? So I wonder if we might just talk a little bit about what kind of questions students are asking and what they're looking for at different points broadly in the schooling journey, and how we do then start conversations that are age appropriate, noting that there'll be lots of different experiences for different students, including traumatic experiences, right, that need to be kind of stepped through really carefully. Caitlin, maybe to you first, like what are some of the questions and sort of signposts in terms of starting these conversations?
Yeah, sure. I'll probably leave the primary age to Stephen because I think that's more his field of expertise than myself. But some of the conversations I've had with parents in rolling out our new programs in Cairns has been, I suppose I'd anticipated a lot of apprehension from parents and maybe even resistance around don't scandalise my young people, don't do it too early. But in fact, we've had the opposite because of the signs and times they live in with the access to internet. Parents are getting these questions very young out of the things that happen on the buses and the playgrounds and what kids are exposed to because of these marvelous smartphones in their pockets. So if anything, the parents I've encountered said, hey, can we address things younger, which has been pleasantly surprising for me, but I'll let Stephen talk more about primary age. As far as secondary, it's got to be more than a once off. It can't be these fly-in speakers who do a day. And as someone who was originally going to build my consent education business on this model, I've learned a lot in the research to say it's not the best model, but this is why our schools need to be a place where our staff are confident, because it needs to be consistent messaging and consistent conversations. And the one thing our young people want more than anything else is for it to be dialogical. They want to be able to converse and be part of the conversation. But as far as what happens at what age when we're talking high school, we absolutely need to be talking about sexting. Unfortunately, from year 7, we need to be educating them on what the laws are. It's so common in high school that they need to understand, hang on, there's ramifications here and the impacts. And if we come from a values-based framework, not just a legal information thing, you have to start as young as possible about building those values and the understanding of the dignity of the human person, for then the laws and everything. You have to give them that why for the what to make sense, if that, and that can't start young enough appropriately. But as far as explicit content, sexting as early as possible in high school. Then gender stereotypes, is the research is saying, is one of the key foundational things to stopping relationship violence. So gender stereotypes can start earlier, but certainly explicitly in year 7, power dynamics. We've chosen to speak explicitly about porn from a Catholic perspective up here in year 9. I know other programs, secular programs, will do that younger, but we talk about inappropriate images at a younger age, but not explicitly about porn until later on. So it is about those building blocks, if that makes sense. And if you're coming from a values-based framework, the building blocks are easier because the goal is all about helping them understand their worth and dignity and other people's worth and dignity, rather than just these other issues. You know, it brings life to puberty and our bodies being mind-blowingly marvelous, even if when they're awkward and uncomfortable. And then it gives life to issues like consent as well. So, but Stephen, I think you've got a lot more wisdom to offer in that primary space than I do.
So Stephen, what does need to happen so those conversations can be opened up at secondary level? I hate to be obvious about it. We have a national curriculum. And in the national curriculum, in the health and physical education space, there's a whole space on health. And the health curriculum is where all of these things, this content exists. That's how we approach it from a Brisbane Catholic Education point of view. Now, the challenge I have found in my role in visiting schools is the health curriculum being taught and implemented the way it should be? Now, I can't speak to Melbourne. I can't speak to other people from other dioceses or other places, but more often than not, when we focus on things, who's that being left to in high schools? It's being left to the phys ed and health teachers. However, we've found that oftentimes it's not always the health and phys ed teacher who has those conversations with the teacher, with the student. The student will often have those conversations and ask those questions with the person they're most comfortable with, which might be their pastoral room teacher. It might be a counsellor. It might be somebody else they've got a good relationship if they feel with that. So sometimes it's really important to, even though you don't teach health as such, you need to understand what's in the curriculum. Now, if we're teaching the curriculum from prep through, and I think that's when David's question, when do these conversations start? As soon as your kid is talking, exploring their body, 2. It starts at 2. It doesn't start at 12 or 15. It starts in the family home, and the Catholic teaching on this is that the parents are the first educators of their child. So parents have a responsibility, and I'm not trying to lecture or be moralistic, but have a responsibility to look after their own children. And look, my father was a family therapist and a social worker and worked in child protection for many years as well. He often said to us that when I was a teacher, he said, I would talk to parents and say to them, do you teach your child how to cross the road? And they'd say, yes, of course, because I don't want them to get run over. He'd say, do you teach your child not to touch a hot stove? Yes, of course, I don't want them to get burned. Do you teach your child about safe behaviour and sexual abuse? Not sexual abuse, but how to look after their body? No. And their body, well, why not? Why is it any different? And that was from a child protection point of view. And I think too often we think that the conversation has to take place at a particular time. The conversation takes place when it's powerful and authentic and when it comes up. So when you're as a parent, when you're in the bathroom with your child and they're in there and they're trying to touch their brother's genitals in a way that's not appropriate and you're having a bath together, you don't just laugh it off and go, oh, he's just having fun. You have an opportunity, if they're 5 and 7 or whatever else, to talk about protective behaviours and body parts and how we name them and why it's not appropriate to grab somebody. I've had so many conversations with prep kids who come in, boys in particular,
and want to go around whacking each other's bottoms and grabbing each other on the penis. And you bring them in and you're saying, hey, guess what? It's not appropriate. But you don't say this is not appropriate, don't do it and get angry. We talk about what those body parts, we talk about boundaries, and we talk about that. So the conversation, when you say to David's question, you start the conversations as soon as they start school. And then you look at the national curriculum, and the national curriculum says, here's the safety, here's the relationships and sexuality stuff. And in prep, it's got naming body parts and conversations around that. And then again, it has stuff on relationships. Now, what we do in BCE, we say, but there is a Catholic perspective around that. So it starts with the fact that you are a gift. You are in dignity and you know, made in the image and likeness of God. And so in an age-appropriate way, you would have that conversation. The conversations and the questions you're going to get asked with grade 6 boys and girls is going to be different because the topics and the development stages are different. Again, you go to the curriculum, but also you have to say, what am I comfortable with giving and what are the other resources that support that? As Caitlin's saying, there can be a consent and sexuality program, but it can be written, you're teaching the curriculum and you bring the resources that are going to support you in those conversations. Another critical part, I think, and we would say, and it's a hard one, I think, particularly in the secondary space, and Caitlin's already alluded to it about, you know, bringing it, how do we bring parents into the conversation? Our schools struggle with that, high schools in particular. How do I get my parents engaged? Because my experience as a parent of a high school student is once they hit high schools like to keep you at a distance because, yeah, we've got it all sorted. And the kids and the parents are happy for that because they're all older and self. But if we're going to have these conversations, so it seems that, we've got consent issues and suddenly it's a big issue. Well, because we haven't developed the partnerships and we haven't talked about what is a respectful relationship. We haven't done justice to our boys or our girls from a very young age to give them the skills and the language. And in fact, they call us to account. So Chantel Contos has to call us to account through her consent webpage because we then get caught hopping because we haven't taken responsibility ourselves. And it's not easy, but we have to do it. I'm just looking at one from Kevin. Kevin, you've put one in about tips, diversity, different experiences, secondary classroom.
So we might come to that. Just to go to part of that, just want to talk a little about, both of you have kind of, I think, suggested and hinted at that the consent only kind of conversation is too limited, and from a Catholic perspective, doesn't reveal the richness of how we might understand the human person and relationships. Can we just unpack a little bit how those things sit together, the importance of a really kind of blunt conversation about what your obligations as a young person or as an adult, but maybe a young person but still an adult, or even pre, the legal obligations on minors in this space, having really clear conversations about that alongside the deeper, richer, hopefully conversation that might be informed by Catholic teaching. Do they work together? Is there a challenge in terms of making sure that they don't sort of cut across each other, or that the communication doesn't become problematic for students in terms of clarity of message?
We'll take that one, Kate.
Yeah, happy to.
I'm happy to come in on that one, but I'm happy to come in after you.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about this. And Pope Francis, I don't have the quote in front of me, and it's very dodgy trying to quote a pope when you don't have the writings in front of me. But in Amoris Laetitia, he writes really beautifully about how moral formation needs to happen dialogically, as part of conversation in step-by-step formation, not as a guide of absolute truths. Because I think for those of us who grew up in an atmosphere of being given absolute truths, the anarchist in us wants to go, boom, let me explore and figure out what that is, you know. So I think we've learned that, you know, the strict do this, do that because I say so, or we say so, or the church says so, or the law says so, is totally ineffective. Young people don't buy into it, or they don't come to it from that way. So I think without giving a really deep why and being able to have conversation around that why, young people just will see through it if they're not brought into the conversation, if they can't contribute, and if they can't understand the context behind, you know, the beauty of some of our church teaching. And yes, that's the quote there. Thank you, David. Brilliant. I didn't butcher it too badly, I don't think. But yeah, that is key. And I think that's key whether you're in a Catholic school, a Christian school, or a state school. I don't believe that Catholics have the monopoly on the dignity of the human person. In fact, it's part of the UN Human Declaration of Rights. So I think if we don't understand the dignity of people, then the rest is just rules, you know, there's no life to it. And including for ourselves, one of the issues, if you just teach about consent, an example is I might consent to someone might say, hey, can I punch you? Yeah, sure, go for it. I'm consenting, right? So violence is still violence. If I have an understanding and a formation and a grounding and an understanding of my value and my worth, that's what brings consent to life. That's what makes me go, the reason I'm going to say, no, you can't punch me, no, you can't overstep my boundaries, or I'm not going to do those things to you, is because I believe in my goodness, and I believe in yours, and I'm going to. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like that. No, I won't muddy the waters by saying that, but I think Pope Francis says that beautifully. And I think we know the nature of humans. If we give unquestionable truths, we just want to question them. We're not going to buy into that. It's being able to give our space to explore the why and the context.
Because some of us might find those truths beautiful, but they're not self-evident in what is effectively a secular post-Christian kind of culture, are they? So kids come into the classroom, you say human dignity's, you know, enshrined in biblical faith and it's in the UN Charter. They say, so what? We live in a transactional kind of society in lots of ways. So how does that kind of conversation start or get modelled so that it is engaging in that dialogical way?
I think, could I jump in there just for a sec? I think a couple of things. I think part of what you raised there, Julian, too, is the challenge, and don't want to use words I don't understand, but we talk about postmodernism and, you know, the idea of neoliberalism, right, in regards to the transactional nature. It's become the dominant consumerist idea in the West, almost that the hegemony that we don't even recognize it. It's just built into our way of thinking. So when we then try and talk another way of doing that, it seems almost foreign. And that's a real challenge. The way we would try and talk about it is through the idea of lenses. So, you know, a relationship or even sexuality or consent, you can look at through, if we take sex, because we're talking broadly about that with teenagers. There was one particular teacher in one of our schools in a health physical class, grade 9 classes, and I think I've spoken to Michael about this before, where when they were trying to engage students about learning, they were talking about the health stuff, and they said they gave them a whole range of different perspectives. And they created a scenario. So they create the scenario and they deliberately chose to make it a 15-year-old boy and an 18, 19-year-old girl. So the power imbalance of rather than traditional, you know, older guy, younger girl, they flipped it. And they said, you know, the scenario was around the guy, the girl was interested in having a sexual relationship with this young fella. And what should he do? And so, okay, we're talking with year 9s, boys and girls. And so let's look at this through a number of different lenses. So if we look at sex itself, we can say, let's look at sex through a biological lens. How does sex work? Valid lens. We can look at it through a health lens. So that means we can talk about sexually transmitted diseases. We can talk about the use of using, you know, condoms and other sort of, you know, so what can't remember the word when you're trying to prevent sex, pregnancy. Can't remember the word. It's gone off my mind. Anyway, but so we can talk about from that lens. We can talk about sex from a relationship lens. What are the impacts of having sex from a relationship point of view? Is it always going to be fun? Is it, are both people going to feel it the same way? I wonder how this person might feel. We can talk about it from the parent's perspective. How do your parents feel? So it's about empathy as well. How do we view it through different lenses? We can look at it through a legal lens. So we can go consent, legal. If you do this, you're going to jail. So trying to build in our students contraception. Thank you, Anna. Yes, that's the one. Thank you so much for helping. Yeah. So what lens are we choosing to look at sex and relationships through? And each of them might have validity, but each of them is going to be slightly different in terms of their nuance. And what we can do from a Catholic perspective, in terms of our own tradition, is say the Catholic Church has a view on all of this. What is it? Why is it held? Is it valid? What's life-giving about it? That's not for, maybe you don't want to follow it. Maybe you think it's not suiting I want to feel what I feel now and I'm going to do it because I can. I think we have that in our society too. I will do it because I can. Well, should you not do it because you can? What about the alternative there? And so we can present the Catholic perspective as saying, yes, it seems like a lot of don'ts, but it's shaped around an understanding of the human person and the notion of family, of bringing children into the world. So when we talk about sex, do we talk about it as procreative and life-giving? And what's that? So in a Catholic understanding, its primary purpose is to bring children into the world. Once we remove that through contraception, it's a do your own thing as long as it feels good. Because in the consent conversations that I observe in the media, it's so long as everybody's agreeing, go for it. It feels good, just do it. But that leads to all sorts of problems. And we see it all the time. And it's also interesting. You can go on to TED Talks. You can go on to Oprah. You can go on to, you can talk to Brene Brown. The number of people of all ages who are still trying to figure out sex and what's the right things to do. Or you can watch, late night SBS shows from Germany, which give you all sorts of interesting things, The thing is, though, what's at the heart of it is our humanness. And that sex and our sexuality is a life force and a powerful one that draws us into loving relationships to procreate, to continue our species. How do we try and get that across to kids if we don't ever talk to them about it in that sort of way? And then allowing them to say, here's the different perspectives. Let's look at the pros and cons of this. So examine the Catholic perspective and say, what's good or bad about it? What's challenging about it? What's demanding about it? How might it be life-giving? And then once you've considered all the options, give us your decision on what this young fella should do. I'm not going to tell you what you should say, but I'm going to teach you to critically think about it. I'm going to treat you with respect, that you're old enough to have this conversation with me. But I'm going to treat sex and sexuality with respect. I'm not going to trivialize it. And Pope Francis talks about that in Amoris Laetitia as well. A society and a world in which we trivialize sex and sexuality as something frivolous, rather than treating it with respect as the gift that it is and talking about it with the seriousness with which it deserves, but not making it too moralistic. I don't know whether that really helps.
I think so. Caitlin, just thinking about and going back to Kevin's question, just thinking about the richness of the approach, the seriousness of the approach, I suppose, that Stephen's picking up, given the sort of diversity of contexts, experiences that, Year 9's coming to that hypothetical that Stephen raises. Some of them will have had significant sexual experiences, some of them will have had none. We're, I think, increasingly aware that some of them will have had sexual experiences that have been, abusive or traumatic. How does that conversation then play out, given all those different experiences in a classroom? And how do teachers be sensitive to that?
Yeah, because basically what we're asking is for our teachers not only to teach curriculum, but to be trauma-informed in how they teach curriculum. And then when you add a Catholic perspective and our Catholic schools onto it, you're really asking them to be masters of a space that is not yet mastered. It's significantly challenging. I think the question of diversity in our classrooms is crucial when we're talking about anything of social sciences and the human space and the human or humanity, particularly when we're talking about a space where there is potentially trauma in the room. And that can be the case from prep through to year 12 to when I'm delivering staff or parent formation in this space, And
for teachers too, Caitlin.
Yeah, big time. Yeah.
We have teachers who've got their own trauma within their own relationships that they bring to it. And also when you're asking teachers to talk to teenagers, as you're saying there, Julian, who might have significant sexual experience, you might actually have a teacher there who doesn't. Yeah. Depending on the age and experience of that teacher. So that's really important, because some teachers, who's the one teaching that? Because I had a question from a female teacher at a high school in the Brisbane Archdiocese, who said, yeah, but if I'm teaching 17-year-old boys and you're asking me to teach that, I'm not comfortable with it. So I think the right person for the right job as well. Sorry, Caitlin.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think the question of diversity is crucial, because we're not just talking about diversity of sexual experience. We're not talking about diversity of religious beliefs. We're not just talking about diversity of culture. We're talking about diversity of family experiences. And then, we're talking about sexual and gender diversity as well. And a lot of it, I think the beauty of this framework almost that Pope Francis is giving us, and that quote David's put in the chat, is we're asking for conversation. We're asking for the people in front of us, whether that is our students, our staff, our parents, to engage in dialogue. We're not asking them to sit and listen to a set of rules or guidelines and react out of their experience, potentially their trauma, or their lack of experience, which some find confronting for themselves. We're asking them to engage with it in a way, because first and foremost, yes, we are absolutely sexual beings, but the first part of our nature, the church would teach us, is that we're rational and that we're free. And the minute we take away someone's rationality and freedom, we're actually compromising their experience of truth, because we're dominating that. Sorry, that's getting into a bit of theological grounds. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I think that framework it sounds like such a romantic space, but to not be afraid of letting the people in front of us, whether it's young people, staff, parents, bring their authentic experience, and not being afraid of not having all the answers. The minute we think we are experts in this space and we have to be able to answer it and we have to guide it, we're not God. Like, most of the church's teaching in this space isn't dogma. So even the church is saying, hey, there's space here that we could have this a bit askew. So for particularly if I'm thinking about our secondary students who are gender or sexually diverse and feel uncomfortable automatically before you even start speaking about relationships and sexuality in a Catholic setting, it's about giving them the space to be authentic and to contribute to the conversation, and not being fearful of that yourself, because first and foremost, before their sexuality, they are a human being with dignity, and they're made in the image and likeness of God with rationality and freedom. So it's about dealing with our own fear and not needing them to fit into our boxes, but being able to have them engage in that conversation. And sometimes it'll take a bit of convincing that they are welcome to that conversation and in that space. But yeah,
I think not underestimating kids too, of any age. Not underestimating them. And again, I think when I listen to Caitlin, the idea of creating a safe space, I think whenever you're going to undertake any of this work, even you can look at any researchers who've undertaken work in this space, they talk about before you even enter into the conversation or the dialogue, you need to create the safe space within the boundaries of the classroom. How do you create, first of all, the safe space about what we're going to talk, what stays in, what goes outside? Because if you don't create a safe space, there's not going to be a chance that students develop a vulnerability there. And also, that depends on the teacher's relationship and how comfortable they are doing it. But children are capable of saying profound things and thinking quite profoundly, even at very young ages. I remember my son once, who's now almost 12, coming into me early one morning. He would have been maybe in grade 2, maybe 7. And he says to me, "Dad, I want to ask you something." I said, "Yeah, sure." It's probably 5:30 in the morning or something. Anything you want. Just, it was always open, trying to be the good parent. He said, "I want to know who I am." And I said, what do you mean? And he said, "Well, I know who I am. I'm Bede." And he says, "I know how I get here. I get it about the sperm and the egg." I went, "Righto, that's good. We've done our job there, I think." And he said, "But I want to know who I was before that. Where was I? Where was I in the world? Am I just some random, or what was I? Where was I before that? Did I exist in the universe or not?" And I said, "Oh, that's a really good question." And I said, "Mum will be home from the walk in about 5 minutes, and I think you should ask her." But again, as a young, now I didn't remind him of that story. He says, "I don't even remember saying that, did I?" No remembering of it. But it's an example of how young people, kids as young as 6 and 7, are thinking very deeply about who they are and their place in the world and what they are. What those questions and opportunities present is opportunities, if we think about it, what might I say at that moment? Sure, I can defer to my wife. Or I can say, mate, in my Catholic thing, you can say, you know, you are a gift. You were always gift, and you've been given this gift, and you're a gift for us. And when you can, as you say in the book that they've talked about there, Before I Was Me, you know, we can talk about that in our tradition of gift. And what does that gift then mean? If you've been given as gift this life and everything that who you are, what does that mean about who you are as a person and your dignity and how you respect yourself? And what does that mean if you respect yourself and your dignity? What does that mean for then how you would treat others? And I think that's where the opportunity as a parent is always there, but to be on the lookout for those powerful and authentic opportunities that present themselves in class when these things come up, whether you're in high school or anything else, not forcing it. Today, kids, we're going to talk about this and you're all going to listen. In the context, in the appropriate context where it comes up, an opportunity might present if the relationship has been built where there's a powerful moment, but we have to be able to recognize it and then seize it and feel confident in ourselves that we can do it.
So I'm going to ask then, and just a reminder for participants to please feel free to put questions into the chat as we go along. That sense of being ready for when the conversation happens, and Stephen, you talked before about the conversation maybe happening with any person at school, the person where the trust is, right? So it might not be role specific. What are some strategies to ensure that members of a Catholic school community are kind of comfortable in being available to have these conversations and maybe have some sense of the Catholic tradition, whether they feel part of it or not, that they can lean on? And then the probably second part of that is then how that moves out to parents and engaging them in the conversation. But if we start with sort of staff in a school community, how do we sort of do that upskilling so that they feel comfortable when the need arises?
Well, I mean, from our context, in our school context here, what we've tried to do, and you know, the success or not success of it really is, it's still in the balance because you try the best you can. We've tried to provide resources, certainly in a Catholic perspective, through the curriculum and through our resources as a system that try and provide the theological background in a practical way to our teachers. Sometimes it comes across as a bit heavy and they don't always want to read it, but that's okay. So one thing that we did as a system, and if you want to look at Brisbane Catholic Education's resources on this, you only have to look up the BCE, Brisbane Catholic Education curriculum. The Brisbane Catholic Education, look, this is going to be a problem when the curriculum updates and changes and it goes more online in different ways. But anyway, at the moment, it's all there. We've got to, we built a curriculum app for ourselves, for our teachers here. And within that, in the health curriculum, we said there's a Catholic perspective, and whenever a Catholic perspective appears within the curriculum itself, we've got a little blue and yellow cross. So if you go into the BCE curriculum and you find a blue and yellow cross, you'll see that the Catholic perspective is wherever that is. And then there was an overarching statement that's written in relation not just to the health curriculum, but all curriculum areas, where we say, what would a Catholic perspective have to say about this? And then within the health curriculum in particular, because that's where this started for us over almost 8 or 10 years ago, and it was precipitated by the fact that the health curriculum is where this stuff where it starts to fall in the curriculum. So we had an issue where we looked at it and said, well, we've got this problem. It's now in the health curriculum. What are our schools doing in it? And then we went and looked and went, they're not doing much. It's all higgledy-piggledy. It's all over the spot. How do we give them the understanding of what that might be from our perspective? So the app's been built. If you go into the content area for the health area and you go into the extension to the elaboration of the learning description, you'll have in our app the curriculum on one side, and then you'll have a Catholic perspective on the other. Now, it's not say you now have to teach this as another curriculum area. It's background for the teacher. Even then, even though we've tried to condense it, it is also it's important to say it has the bishops, archbishops imprimatur, and has been through the moderator, but it's trying to put a contemporary, understanding of the theology. It's connected to scripture, all the rest of it. So it's got all of that. And then it has an area where it talks about promote, challenge, and explore. What are the areas, given your context of your teachers' kids? So that's there in the health curriculum for those people. But again, if there's a teacher who say, I'm concerned that you might not know what this is, you can go, oh, here's the Catholic perspective. Let's have a conversation about that. Well, that requires time. Where do you agree or disagree with that? Now, in that, there are hyperlinks to a more detailed theological background paper that was written in conjunction with a moral theologian and people within our system. And that's got lots of information. And there's also a search engine there. So you can type in gender and it'll do a search of the background, theological background piece, and it will give you 5 sections of where the word gender appeared. If you do that, section 3, paragraph 3 is probably the biggest, which might concern transgender stuff, probably the best. But it comes from a pastoral approach as much as possible and tries to be contemporary. So what we try to do is provide the resources for the teachers, first of all, to go there and look. The feedback we've got is sometimes it's a bit dense and heavy, so they don't necessarily always want to read it. But how do we draw them into that conversation to give them the actual, so if a question does come up, and you can search rape and it'll give a Catholic perspective on rape. And what does that look like? So if a teacher's concerned, they can go, well, this is what a Catholic perspective is on that. And as I say, it's all publicly available, and it had to be through the imprimatur because everybody can possibly read it. So that's one way to actually try and build your teacher capacity, but they need to have the time and the effort to go in there to have a look at it, see what that is. And then from the point of view of so the promote, challenge, and explore, well, you're teaching the health curriculum, or if you're not, what's this information? If someone does come and say this, how might you deal with it? Now you've got wellbeing people, counsellors, everybody else in schools. I mean, they've got a plethora of resources. So we're really providing a Catholic perspective that can then support other things. But the formation of conscience is gradual, and knowing that you're going to have kids in there who are sexually active and not having, the kids are going to experiment as curious. Curiosity doesn't have a socioeconomic background. Curiosity is all kids. And they're going to be curious, and you're going to meet those kids who, regardless of what you say, they're going to try everything. I remember teaching grade 6 and 7 kids. I'm doing everything. I don't care what anybody says, And you're going to have kids who will be really conservative, really anxious and won't. So knowing that, you can say, well, let's just talk about it as it comes up. Don't go out searching to say, right, today we're talking about masturbation. That's not going to work. But you have to be ready for that question in grade 6, because what if a kid does ask it? What are you going to say? I don't know. Oh, well, how do we choose to downplay it? What do we choose to say about, the gradualness is, how do you work kids through the formation of moral conscience, which is a long-term thing. Parents, much harder, I think, Julian, because you've got to try and take on, that's a whole other kettle of fish. As I said, that's where our schools really, primaries, I think, have more luck. They put things in their newsletters, they have parent forums. Secondary spaces, all you can do is be invitational. Always invite, always say, what are we going to do in that?
Caitlin, from you on opening up those spaces with parents, but also with staff, if you've got other reflections,
Yeah, I think, as Stephen mentioned, the resourcing is crucial, like equipping really well. But I think giving staff a space, and this is hard logistically, we're lucky in Cairns that we are a smaller diocese with 30 schools. There's still immense demands on that. But to be able to provide a space for staff PD where we're modelling those conversations in the classroom, where the professional learning we're offering is dialogical and is about exploring and getting comfortable. So we're modelling with our staff how we want them to hold that space for the young people. And that's, I think it's crucial because of the nature of this space and the level of trauma in this space for our staff, not everyone is going to feel safe, not even just capable, but feel safe to deliver curriculum. So the resources are crucial, but without knowing our staff, without being in relationship with our staff and being able to journey with them, it still might come to nothing. I'm a big believer that we can have all the curriculum and resources and they can be evidence-based and objectively perfect. I don't think that exists, but and yet if we have not invested in relationship with our staff for them to become comfortable to hold that space for our young people, if we're not modeling that with our staff and with our parents, they're not going to get taken up the way you'd hope when you're investing in resources and things.
Yeah, I think too with staff, some of the richest conversations I've had with staff, we when we were rolling this whole, Catholic perspectives in relationships and sexuality, we called it here in BCE, and we had a beautiful, shape paper, which is now a bit dog-eared, but anyway. One of the things we did as we rolled it out over the first 3 or 4 years was we visited every school in the diocese in terms of, we've got 145, 46 schools, and as EOs, we supported the person who wrote the shape paper and everything, who was enrolled, who was working with us at the time, and we went into 3-hour twilight with all the schools that we supported, in the diocese. And it was really an introduction to the shape paper to get them to think about what is a Catholic perspective, because it was, for most people, it's thou shalt not, don't do anything. And that's where it stopped. And then you would get teachers to talk about what we've already talked about today. What's been your experience? Where did you learn about it? What are your concerns? So open up the dialogue space for teachers. And the richness, teachers care. They care deeply, but they want to know what to do. And one of the things, the surveys that came out in our stuff is, the use of the general capabilities in the national curriculum was social and emotional capabilities, or social interpersonal capabilities as a general capability in the national curriculum, yet it just wasn't being accessed and used at all. And so a lot of these resources are built into the national curriculum as general capabilities, they're built in the national curriculum as health, and then we're saying, all right, what resources third-party resources, as Caitlin said, can be got aplenty. You can provide everything to the teacher and they can still not do it, because they don't want to and they choose. And that's where we would talk about the explicit curriculum, the null curriculum, and the implied, the explicit, implicit, and the null curriculum. So you've got the explicit curriculum, that's what you choose to teach, which for a lot of kids is around, this is how babies are made. You've got the implied curriculum, the things we sort of talk about in general rule, and you've got the things we avoid talking about. And I think it's the null curriculum we always have to pay attention to. And then about saying, well, once we had these conversations, we started to open up what a Catholic perspective was. And we looked at what is the best practices. And there were 14. So Kerry, who wrote this document for us and worked with us on it, she did research. We looked at all the research around the world, not just from a Catholic perspective. And she looked at John Paul II's theology of the body and all of those things. Some of the quotes now, the Amoris Laetitia had only been released at the time. So again, bringing all those in, but some of those, that allowing the time for teachers to discuss, to be in service, to have their concerns raised and aired, and try and present them with the resources that we had available to then continue that dialogue was what we found critical.
So a final opportunity for a question. If anyone's got one, I must say I'm feeling kind of struck by the, I suppose, the invitational element from Pope Francis's line on the dialogical nature of this conversation, and how important it is for church leaders to be giving permission for this conversation to happen, because of that kind of sense amongst maybe some staff that the null part of the curriculum is because we're Catholic and we don't talk about this stuff, and how big an issue that is. Yeah.
Well, I'm a teacher in this school and I don't agree with it.
Yeah, right. So
that's not how I see the world. Yep. So I'm either going to avoid it, or I know I've got to not say what I really truly believe. But again, teaching is not about just saying what you believe or don't believe. Teaching is about critical thinking and dialogue. So we present views and we can have those sorts of things, in there. I mean, it sounds trite to say it because it's the obvious thing that teachers do and they do it well. But how do we create that space? I think the other thing that Pope Francis does in Amoris Laetitia is the idea of discernment, as a good Jesuit, and as you'd appreciate, Julian. But I think, there was that article done in one of the Catholic journals, titled "New Wine for New Wineskins" sort of thing. And in it, I can't remember who the authors of the article were, but we would use it with our teachers. And one of the things it said there is Francis refuses to be drawn by either conservatives or progressives in that particular document. So those conservatives within the Catholic Church who want a definitive answer where it says, here's what it is on sexuality, here's what it is, it's a nice box, we teach that and we don't go from it. He doesn't go there. And he doesn't get drawn into that. And the progressives who want to say we want to open it all up. So he doesn't change doctrine or dogma, but he changes tone. And then when they're saying, tell us what we need to say to people who are living in sin or they're not married, he says, you have to discern. You have to look and journey with people in their context. And I think his Latin American roots or his South American roots come to bear in that, because as a Bishop of Buenos Aires, he walked with people as a shepherd, and he realized it wasn't about carrying a big stick and beating people over the head with it, but neither was it about watering down the teachings, but it was journeying with people and hoping they come towards the vision of what that could be. And I think that's what we do with children and young people and parents and our teachers. We journey with them, we discern, we don't water it down, but we have to go with the challenging conversation. And I think in that interest, I think there was a quote recently from the, what's his name? Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich from, he was an interview with German magazine. I think Frank Brennan said this recently when he spoke at a wellbeing thing for Queensland Catholic Education Commission. It said he called for a fundamental revision of the church teaching regarding same-sex attraction. And he's the president of the European Pan-European grouping of Catholic Bishops' Conference. He says because the sociological and scientific foundation of this teaching is no longer true. And that's a cardinal who's a president of a bishops' conference in Europe. Now, that's a profound statement for a cardinal in the church. And one of Francis's point he's to make. What it also highlights is the importance of this dialogue within church. And the fact that we don't even agree. We've got people with different points of view within church. Never mind people standing outside the church saying, why are we not having an opening up the dialogue about this, or is it all off limits? And Francis can't just go, I'm changing it all, because he knows you'll lead to schism. So how does he draw people into the conversation to start the dialogue about what might need to happen?
Just a final one from the chat, and Caitlin, I might direct this to you. Just this is I suppose this is the practical edge to some of this conversation. As the conversation emerges, what happens, or how are disclosures managed? What happens when we touching on issues that, as we've said, many in the classroom will have experience of, and in kids disclosing either things that are problematic for reasons of others, knowing, or problematic for legal reasons. How does that what's best practiced in managing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm pretty firm on this, which might surprise some people, but I think first, the underage and the consent, the legal stuff, I don't want to be too specific, because unfortunately one of the issues in Australia is every state is different, and then the federal law is different. There's a great website if you're wanting to know what your laws are in your state called Youth Law. I think it's just youthlaw.org.au, but if you look up Youth Law Australia, it'll come up, and you can look up per state. It's great. It's a great one to give your young people as a tool. So as far as the legal things and about whether the kids get into trouble, I would say generally when there's not maliciousness involved in age of consent issues, particularly if both are under the age of consent, it's very rare that kids are charged. There usually needs to be some kind of power imbalance, violence involved if they're in a consenting relationship, even though they're under the age of consent. So technically the law would say they can't consent. Usually legally it's okay. What I would say to you as a person of authority in your young people's lives is if they are disclosing that they are that they're having a relationship under the age of consent with someone who is over the age of consent, that you absolutely report that through your processes. A number of reasons I want to say this. One, cover your butt. Like, you're first and foremost, you're a staff member in a school, and above your relationship with them, that you have legal responsibilities and you have ethical responsibilities. But also for the young person, sometimes they come to us and they disclose these things because they're testing, and they'll say it so calmly, but they're testing whether it's okay. Regardless, even if they don't know it's okay or not, they might as adults come to realize, hey, that wasn't okay. And the adults I told in my life didn't reinforce that that wasn't okay. They let it go, probably out of pastoral care for me, out of not wanting to make my life difficult, but maybe had a young person in that situation heard. And I'm not speaking, this situation was my life. This had happened to me as a 14-year-old. And I often think back and think if one of the adults I'd spoken to and mentioned it to offhandedly had done something, that would have been a very significant circuit breaker in how I experienced my worth, my dignity, and my bodily autonomy. So you may feel like you're doing a disservice to your young person in doing your duties and reporting, but actually what you're doing is standing up for their dignity, regardless of whether they understand their own dignity in that space or not. So I'm very firm on that, perhaps because of my lived experience. But I believe that lived experience has kind of given me some insight as to why it is the most loving thing to do is to report.
I think too, when you're saying to Caitlin and her experience there, I think, what is it that causes a person to lose their voice?
Yeah.
Because as we see, you have to look over the last 3 years, #MeToo, Brittany Higgins, Grace Tame, things have gone on in the federal parliament and nationally over the last 12 months. People not finding their voice. We only have to look at what happened when, in the media, as Kimberly Kitchens dies, and all of a sudden everything comes out about bullying. And is it political and just the argy-bargy, or is it actually what causes a person to not speak up and find their voice? And I think that starts with all of our kids, and from an educative point of view, from the moment they enter prep, not when they get to 14. So that's hard. And I'm not just talking females or women. Why do men not find their voice? Men who are bullied, men who are picked on, men who don't speak out because of fear of retribution or the bigger guy or anything else like that. We are all silenced in our own way for various reasons. And when we go to what should we do in consent, well, when someone discloses, the intention, I guess, from our point of view, it says a system, and I imagine it's the same for everybody online. You have legal requirements as a person now. We have our training, our student protection training that we do every year, and I would encourage, the challenge is take those things seriously, because it's not. And again, we've lived through a sexual abuse crisis in a Royal Commission where the credibility of the Catholic Church is shot to pieces as an authority in this space. We can't afford, as an organisation or even as individuals, but even before all that, young people deserve our support as young people to live lives to the full. How come that you might have life and have it to the full? You have the right to flourish. Therefore, when they disclose, we have an obligation, not just legally, but to the other person as a human, to act. We can go to our tradition. We can talk about the Good Samaritan story. We can talk about any number of stories within our tradition where that is, but speaking truth and speaking up can come at a cost. And we have to have the courage to do that. Can I just address one question though, Julian, the one that I think M. Hall, I don't know if that's a man or a woman, has put in there?
Just, Steve, welcome to. I just note that we're running over time.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Maybe very briefly, if you can, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, so just in terms of, is there any time to speak your own opinion? I think the idea of a teacher is always to have critical distance in any area, right? Whether it be your opinion about sexuality, and also whether it be your opinion politically, about environmental issues, any of those sorts of things. So what is our role as teacher is a really important question. It's inevitable that we will bring ourselves, because we teach who we are. And so that's going to come through. I think in terms of being witness, though, to the mission of the Catholic school, I think what's beholden upon us is that we can create the dialogue space. It's beholden upon us, though, to understand the Catholic perspective, so that or whatever that is, so that if we do disagree, we understand why, but we can answer student questions in an authentic way, but without having to say, well, I think it's stupid. I think we have to be careful of that, because that's the sort of thing, when you have parent complaints and everything else, you leave yourself exposed. I know that's challenging, but it's the same thing as a person. As a teacher, I didn't go in and go, I'm a Labor voter. Anybody who votes for Liberal's an idiot. I wouldn't do that in a classroom, because that's not what you should be doing, because you're opening dialogue and ideas. So understand the Catholic perspective as best as you can. Become familiar with it. Understand why you don't agree with it and what you do agree, but understand that you're creating, in an educative sense, this is the position. This is how it is. What do we think about that? Where is the good in that too? Where is the possibility of the good?
Can I just add really quickly? I know we're over time, but also, if you're vehemently supportive of your Catholic faith and you're wanting to voice those opinions, the question should always be, is my opinion going to make any person I'm speaking to feel less than? Because then I would say maybe our filter's not quite there. Is the opinion I'm about to say going to damage the person in front of me's relationship with God? Because that's not my place, no matter what my beliefs are. I just wanted to add that on. So
in a sense, a beautiful place to finish, because I think the conversation, which has ranged across some of the basics maybe of consent education, and then the richness of Catholic tradition and the practicalities of engaging with it, we've kept coming back to that sense of being really student focused and engaging in dialogue and discussion with students and meeting them where they're at. And so, Caitlin and Stephen, thanks so much for engaging in this conversation and for participants for being part of it and for asking great questions. Thank you very much. And I pass back to Michael.
Thanks. So look, just a final note of thanks to Julian, to Stephen and Caitlin. Thanks also for those of you who've submitted questions and added to the conversation. It's been really great following the session. Really appreciate the openness with which everyone's been able to share. Just a reminder that we have recorded this session, and the recording will be made available in the next few days. Those of you who are in the Victorian Diocese who registered for accreditation will be uploading your attendance to the platform, so that's fine. If there's anything, and those of you in other dioceses, if there's anything we can do to help with accreditation in your own diocese, we'd be more than happy to liaise on that as well. So we'll have more sessions next term, I think. So please keep an eye out for those. But just thank you so much to Caitlin and Steve in particular. I think it's been a really great session. I think a couple of you asked for the email addresses, which are there in the chat. So if you are looking to get in touch with either Stephen or Caitlin, those are there in the chat. But for the moment, we'll just say thanks apologies also for running a little bit over time, but there were some really good, if a little bit hairy questions there at the end. So thanks also for those. But look, thanks everyone, and really appreciate you being on board. So, and hopefully see you again soon.